The wind carried the smell of dry earth and distant sagebrush across the prairie, sweeping over the lone schoolhouse that sat like a forgotten toy in the middle of the vast, empty land. Its white paint had long since faded into a dull gray, peeling in thin curls that fluttered like paper under the sun. The tall grass around it swayed with a soft hiss, and the wooden steps creaked in protest against the weight of every passing breeze. Inside, the air was warm with the scent of chalk dust and the faint traces of last week's ink stains. A single clock ticked steadily above the blackboard, filling the silence between the rare calls of a prairie bird outside. Miss Clara sat alone at her desk, her shoulders slightly hunched, a smudge of chalk on the side of her hand. She was not old, not yet, but there was a heaviness in her stillness, the kind that came from living the same day 100 times over. Her dark hair was tied back in a practical bun, and her dress was plain and neatly pressed, though the cuffs were slightly frayed from years of careful washing. She traced the letters on the blackboard, finishing the last sentence of a spelling lesson meant for children who had already run off toward home. The words hung in the stale classroom air, "Courage is a choice." She paused to read it to herself, her lips moving faintly, as if she were trying to believe it. The sunlight fell through the tall windows, carving stripes of gold and shadow across the empty desks. Dust floated in the beams like tiny, aimless planets. Each desk bore the scratches and carved initials of children long since gone. This was a school that had taught generations of the same few families, each leaving behind some quiet mark. Clara's life had narrowed to these walls and the view from the front step, a horizon that promised everything and nothing at once. She rose from her chair and crossed to the window, her boots tapping softly on the uneven floorboards. Outside, the prairie rolled forever, broken only by the thin ribbon of the dirt road and the glint of a faraway windmill. The emptiness was something she had grown used to, but never truly comfortable with. She often imagined voices where there were none, laughter carried on the wind that was only the rustle of grass. Sometimes she would picture herself in another town, a larger one with lantern-lit streets and neighbors who knocked on your door just to share a pie or a story. But this was the place she had inherited, and leaving felt like a thought she would never act upon. She returned to her desk and sat down heavily, letting her hands rest in her lap. A faint sigh escaped her lips. The walls seemed to listen, to hold the sound and give nothing back. On the desk lay a worn book of poetry with a pressed wildflower between its pages, the stem so dry it could snap to dust. She ran a finger along its edge, remembering the spring when she had first picked it, telling herself that one day she might have someone to share it with. Years had passed, and the flower had aged with her quiet hope. The day was winding down into late afternoon, and the sun was beginning its slow slide toward the horizon. Shadows of the windowpanes stretched longer across the floor, inching toward the blackboard. Clara knew she should lock up soon, but there was no rush. There was never a rush. The children would be home, helping with chores or chasing chickens, and the world would carry on just as it always did, with or without her small part in it. She leaned her elbow on the desk and rested her chin on her hand, listening to the faint creak of the roof settling in the heat. Her eyes grew distant, soft with a kind of yearning she had long stopped voicing even to herself. Somewhere, far across the prairie, a low rumble trembled in the earth. She didn't notice it at first, mistaking it for the wind or the far-off groan of the land itself. The sound came again, slightly louder this time, almost like footsteps, but too heavy, too measured. She lifted her head, frowning slightly. Her heart gave a small, inexplicable flutter. The empty world outside the windows seemed to hold its breath. The clock ticked on, unbothered, while Clara straightened in her chair. In that moment, the long stretch of quiet life she had known felt as fragile as the pressed flower in her book, waiting for something, or someone, to touch it and change it forever. Dash dash dash. The low rumble outside grew into a rhythmic pounding, and Clara realized it was the sound of hooves. Slow at first, deliberate, each strike carried through the ground and into the old floorboards of the schoolhouse. She sat up straighter, her hands tightening around the edge of the desk as the vibrations traveled through her boots. In a town where visitors were rare and excitement rarer, the approach of anything, or anyone, felt like the whisper of a coming storm. Through the window, dust rose in a lazy cloud, catching the sunlight in golden streaks. Out of that haze emerged a horse, massive and dark, muscles rolling under its hide like water beneath rock. Upon its back sat a man who seemed to belong to the animal, as if the horse were only an extension of him. He was enormous, broad shoulders stretching his long duster coat, a hat pulled low over his brow. He rode with an unhurried certainty, a man who did not need to rush because the world moved for him. Clara felt her pulse quicken. The children, who had been playing marbles and tag outside in the yard, froze one by one as the rider approached. Laughter died into silence, and wide eyes turned toward the figure cutting across the prairie. He slowed his horse as he neared the small picket fence that lined the schoolyard, dust settling around him like the aftermath of a small storm. For a moment, he sat still in the saddle, his face shadowed, surveying the tiny schoolhouse as if weighing its worth. Clara's breath caught in her throat, though she could not say why. Something in the air shifted, a tension like the moment before thunder cracked. The man swung a leg over and dropped to the ground, the earth shivering under the weight of him. His boots were thick with dust, his spurs giving a single, sharp jingle with every step. The schoolhouse door groaned as it opened, sunlight spilling in behind him and casting his silhouette across the wooden floor. He had to duck to pass under the frame, and even then, his hat brushed the lintel. For an instant, the room felt too small to hold him, his presence filling every corner. Clara rose automatically, the chair scraping against the floor. She could hear her own heartbeat and the faint shuffling of children pressed back against the far wall, peering from behind desks. The man's shadow moved first, long and heavy, before he stepped fully into the classroom. He smelled faintly of leather, horse, and the dry wind that rolled endlessly across the plains. His eyes, when they met hers, were an unflinching gray, the color of storm clouds gathering on a flat horizon. He took her in as though he had ridden here with purpose, as if he had known she would be waiting. Clara opened her mouth to speak, but no words came, her throat had gone dry under the weight of his gaze. "Ma'am," he said finally, his voice deep and rolling like distant thunder. It was not a question, not a greeting, but a statement that filled the room. The word seemed to hang in the still air, and Clara felt it echo in her chest. Then, as though he had rehearsed it on the long ride across the prairie, he continued, "I need a wife." The sentence struck her harder than a clap of thunder. For a heartbeat, she thought she might have misheard. Her eyes widened, her fingers gripping the edge of her skirt to keep them from trembling. The children, emboldened by shock, peeked farther around their desks, their mouths dropping open. He took another step forward, the floorboards creaking under his weight. "And you," he let the pause stretch, his gaze never wavering from hers, "you need strong sons." The words rolled out like a promise and a claim all at once, as if he were telling her not just what he wanted, but what her life lacked and what he could give her. Clara's mind tumbled in a whirl of disbelief, outrage, and a strange, unwelcome spark of curiosity. No one had ever entered her world so abruptly, so boldly. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes, and a loose shutter banged against the siding as if punctuating his declaration. The room held its breath, waiting for her answer, though none would come yet. All she could do was stare at the giant cowboy who had ridden out of the horizon and into the quiet of her life, bringing with him a sentence that would not soon leave her ears. Dash dash dash. Clara's fingers tightened on the edge of her desk until her knuckles whitened. For a long moment, she could not make a sound. The weight of his words pressed down on her like the dry heat of the sun on the prairie, heavy and unrelenting. The classroom seemed smaller than ever, the walls closing in with the intensity of the moment. She could hear the faint creak of the schoolhouse boards beneath her feet, the whisper of wind sneaking through the cracks in the windows, and somewhere in the corner, a child's soft, nervous gasp. The giant cowboy stood as if he had all the time in the world, his thumbs hooked into his belt, his hat casting a shadow across his eyes. His sheer size made everything around him appear fragile, the desks, the blackboard, even Clara herself. He was a figure carved from the land, as immovable and certain as the hills beyond town. Dust from the road still clung to his coat, and a streak of sunlight caught on the silver of his spurs. He did not fidget, did not glance away, he simply waited, his presence filling the room more than any words could. Clara's heart beat so loudly she was certain the children could hear it. She felt every pair of young eyes watching her, sensing that something extraordinary, maybe even dangerous, was happening. Her mouth opened once, closed, then opened again. At last, she found her voice, though it trembled with confusion and disbelief. "Excuse me," she said, her tone half question, half protest. What did you just say?" The man took a step closer, and the floor groaned under his weight. He was so tall that she had to tilt her chin to meet his gaze. I said, he rumbled, each word slow and deliberate, I need a wife. And you need strong sons. Clara's throat tightened. No one had ever spoken to her this way. Suitors, few and far between, had come with shy smiles and mumbled compliments, with offers of supper or the occasional jar of wild honey. None had ever walked into her classroom and announced marriage as though it were a simple transaction, a fact of life as unshakable as the rising sun. Her shock began to give way to a prickling sense of indignation. She straightened her back and took a breath, summoning a firmness she reserved for unruly pupils. Sir, she said, her voice steadying, this is a school. You can't just burst in here and. I can, he interrupted calmly, his deep voice rolling over hers like distant thunder. And I did. The children murmured among themselves, their voices hushed with awe. One boy whispered, he's huge, and another added, like a storybook giant. Clara shot them a sharp glance, and they fell silent, but she could feel their excitement vibrating in the air. To them, this was better than any lesson, better than any tale she could have read from a book. Clara forced herself to draw another breath. Her pulse was a drum in her ears. You don't even know me, she said, her words quieter now, more uncertain. The cowboy finally took off his hat, revealing hair the color of wheat left too long in the sun and eyes that seemed to see straight through her. I know enough, he said. I've been watching this town. Watching you. You're alone. You work hard. And a woman like you ought to have a family. Sons who can carry your name. Sons who can run beside me on the land I own. Strong sons. The repetition of the words sent a strange shiver through her. A part of her bristled. She was not some lonely object to be claimed, not a vessel for a man's legacy. And yet, beneath the outrage, there was an ache she could not ignore. His words touched a truth she kept buried. The quiet of her evenings, the empty chair across her small table, the pressed wildflower in her book that had waited years for someone to notice it. She shook her head quickly, as if to banish the thought. This is madness, she said, though her voice wavered. You can't just ride into someone's life and decide things for them. The cowboy's expression did not change. He set his hat on the nearest desk, and the wood creaked under its weight as though it, too, felt the gravity of him. Maybe, he said simply. But the land don't wait. Life don't wait. And neither do I. The room fell into a stillness so deep that even the wind outside seemed to hesitate. Clara stood rooted to the spot, caught between fear, anger, and the faintest flicker of something she didn't want to name. The children held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next, sensing that their teacher's life had just taken a turn none of them could have imagined. The town came alive with whispers before the sun even set that evening. It began with the children, running down the dusty street with wild eyes and breathless excitement, each eager to be the first to share what they had seen. Their voices carried through the small cluster of buildings that made up the heart of the town, past the general store, the blacksmith's shed, and the weathered saloon with its swinging doors that never quite closed all the way. The tale grew with every retelling. By the time the first child burst into the saloon, gasping between words, the story had already swelled to include the giant cowboy lifting the entire schoolhouse in one hand and declaring Miss Clara his bride with the other. Inside the saloon, the piano player stopped mid-tune, and the card game in the corner froze as the men leaned in to listen. Big Jack, a rancher muttered, the name falling from his lips like a warning. That's the only man it could be. He set his cards down slowly, the corners frayed from years of play. And he's lookin' for a wife. The barkeep, a stout man with a face weathered like old leather, snorted as he polished a glass. More like he's talkin', one, he said. Man like that don't ask. He just says what's gonna happen, and it happens. Word traveled from the saloon to the mercantile, where Mrs. Whitcomb, the storekeeper's wife, stood behind the counter arranging bolts of fabric. Her daughter came running in, breathless from chasing gossip through the street. Ma, she cried, gripping the edge of the counter. Miss Clara's gonna marry a giant. He said he needs a wife and she needs sons. Mrs. Whitcomb froze mid-motion, her fingers tightening around the soft cotton. Oh, mercy, she whispered, her voice carrying a mixture of fascination and alarm. That poor woman. And Big Jack, well, I suppose he's been riding alone too long. By sundown, the entire town was buzzing. Men gathered on the boardwalk outside the saloon, leaning on the railing as if watching for him to appear again. Women huddled near the pump, voices low but urgent, their hands fluttering like restless birds. Everyone knew of Big Jack. Stories about him had drifted in and out of town for years. He was said to own a stretch of land so wide that a man could ride for 3 days and still be under his sky. He was said to have wrestled a bull to the ground with his bare hands. Some claimed he lived with only his horse and a pack of wolves for company. Now he had come down from his lonely kingdom, and he had set his sights on their quiet, unassuming schoolteacher. In the saloon, the debate grew heated. "She can't marry a man like that," said Mr. Tillman, the town's aging postmaster, his voice sharp with disapproval. "He's rough stock. He don't belong to polite company." Another man shook his head, taking a slow sip of whiskey. "Polite company don't last long out here. A woman like Clara, she could use someone who can keep her safe. You seen the way the prairie's been lately. Coyotes bold as sin, and rustlers sniffin' around the herds." A silence followed, and then a laugh broke it, short and uneasy. "Safe," one of the younger ranch hands said. "If she marries Big Jack, she won't need safe. Folks'll be too scared to come within 10 miles of her door." On the edge of town, Clara herself sat at her small kitchen table, the oil lamp flickering shadows across her walls. Though the town hummed with her story, she was alone with her thoughts. Her dinner sat untouched, a slice of cornbread growing cold beside her plate. The words he had spoken at the schoolhouse looped endlessly in her mind. "I need a wife. And you need strong sons." She had spent years thinking she was invisible, a quiet figure moving from school to home and back again. And now, with just a few sentences, a man she barely knew had turned her life into the centerpiece of town gossip. She imagined the eyes on her, the voices speaking her name, and her chest tightened. In the distance, the lonely sound of a coyote's howl rose against the twilight. Clara shivered and thought of the man who had stepped out of the horizon and into her life like a storm. Outside, the voices of the town kept rising, echoing through the streets, and she knew that nothing in her quiet world would ever be the same again. The next morning dawned clear and sharp, the kind of prairie day where the horizon felt impossibly far and the sky stretched blue and endless above the land. Clara rose before the sun fully claimed the town, though she'd barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw him, Big Jack, as the whispers had named him, standing in her classroom with that quiet, unshakable certainty. His words clung to her like burrs. "I need a wife. And you need strong sons." She tried to push them aside as she went about her morning routine. She washed her face in the cold water from the basin, tied her hair back tight, and buttoned her plain gray dress with trembling fingers. The familiar rituals grounded her, but the rhythm of her life had been broken. When she stepped outside, the early light spread across the prairie, painting the tall grasses with a golden sheen. Dew sparkled like tiny shards of glass, and the air held that fragile stillness that comes just before the world fully wakes. Then she heard it, the heavy, deliberate sound of hoofbeats. She froze on her porch, her heart giving a sharp kick against her ribs. Turning slowly, she saw him coming down the dirt road, astride the same massive dark horse. Big Jack sat tall and sure in the saddle, his long coat flaring slightly with the movement, his hat shadowing his face. The rising sun caught in his wheat-colored hair and along the silver of his spurs. He didn't hurry, didn't wave, didn't call out. He simply rode straight toward her as if the world and its choices were already decided. Clara's hand hovered at her side, half wanting to retreat inside, half fixed in place by something she didn't want to name, something between fear and an inexplicable pull. When he reached her small yard, he dismounted in one smooth motion. The ground seemed to notice his weight, and the horse snorted softly, pawing at the dirt. Jack tied the reins to the porch post as if he owned the place, then looked up at her with those storm-gray eyes. "Morning," he said, his voice carrying easily in the still air. Clara swallowed. "Morning," she answered, her voice quieter than she intended. "I figured we'd walk," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. A woman ought to see a man proper before she makes up her mind. She hesitated, glancing down the empty road. I haven't made up my mind about anything," she said carefully, though her pulse was thrumming. Jack's mouth curved, not quite a smile but something like it, brief and knowing. "Then walk with me. Talk, if you like. Or just listen." For reasons she could not fully explain, Clara stepped down from the porch. Her boots crunched in the dirt, and the wind tugged at her skirts. Side by side, they began to walk toward the open prairie, the town shrinking behind them with each step. The world felt impossibly wide out there, the grass rolling like a living sea under the wind. Jack moved with a kind of grounded ease, his long strides carrying him steadily while Clara's shorter steps worked to keep pace. He did not speak immediately, and for a while the only sounds were the wind and the occasional trill of a meadowlark. "You live quiet," he said at last, his voice low and even. "Too quiet for a woman like you." Clara glanced at him sharply. "You don't know me." "I know enough," he said, repeating the words from the day before. "I seen the way you hold yourself. Strong on the outside, but there's a lonesome in your eyes. I know it 'cause I got the same thing in me. Difference is, I don't let it sit and eat me alive." His words stung because they carried a piece of truth. Clara turned her gaze toward the horizon, where the sky met the earth in an endless line. The wind lifted her hair slightly, and she felt the vastness pressing against her, the reminder of how small and solitary her life had been. They walked for what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes. Jack showed her the direction of his land, gesturing with a sweep of his hand. "It's all out there," he said. "Grass, sky, and room for sons to run till their legs give out. A family belongs on land like that. And I aim to have one." Clara's breath caught, and she didn't answer. Every step with him felt like crossing a line she couldn't uncross. He wasn't asking her for permission, he was giving her a vision of the life he believed should be hers. When they finally turned back toward town, Clara felt the weight of two worlds pressing on her chest. The safe, small life she knew, and the untamed horizon that seemed to follow him wherever he went. And she realized, with a tremor she couldn't suppress, that no matter what she said next, her life was already changing. By the third day after Big Jack's arrival, the quiet rhythm of Clara's life had been completely shattered. The town, which usually moved at the pace of wind through prairie grass, now pulsed with restless energy. Wherever she went, eyes followed her. Whispers bloomed in her wake, soft at first, then sharper when she was out of earshot. The schoolchildren watched her as though she were a character in one of the adventure stories she sometimes read aloud, their faces bright with curiosity and a hint of mischief. That morning, she had tried to begin class as usual, her chalk squeaking across the blackboard, but the children were fidgety, their hands twitching above their desks as if holding in words. Finally, little Sarah Whitcomb blurted, "Miss Clara, are you gonna marry him?" The room went silent. Clara froze, chalk hovering in midair. The children stared at her with round, expectant eyes, a mix of awe and thrill lighting their faces. Her heart thudded once, hard, and she forced a calm she did not feel. "We are here to learn our letters and sums," she said, steady but firm. "Not to discuss rumors." "But it ain't a rumor," whispered Thomas, the tallest boy in the room. "He said it plain. Said you need sons." A ripple of giggles followed, quickly stifled when Clara turned. She wanted to scold them, to tell them this was none of their business, but she felt heat rising in her cheeks. In the quiet that followed, she felt the weight of the entire town pressing on her through those small, unblinking eyes. By the time school let out, the weight had followed her into the street. Mrs. Whitcomb herself intercepted her at the pump, arms folded tight over her apron. "Clara," she began, her tone half concern, half intrigue, "I just want to say, a man like that don't come around twice in a lifetime. A woman needs security. And land." Clara stiffened. "I haven't made any decisions." Course, the older woman said, though her eyes sparkled with barely hidden glee. "Just don't take too long. Life passes quicker than you think." Clara moved on, but she could feel the gazes from doorways and windows. A group of men loitered by the blacksmiths, speaking low, but she caught the tail end of their conversation. "Big Jack's serious. When he says something, he means it. She oughta say yes. Ain't safe for a woman to be alone forever." The words dug into her. She reached her small house, her safe place, and closed the door with a click, leaning her back against it as though to hold the world at bay. The air inside was cool and dim, smelling faintly of the lavender she kept by the window. For a moment, she allowed herself to breathe. Then, as if conjured by her thoughts, she heard the distant sound of hoofbeats again. Slow, heavy, inevitable. Her pulse quickened. She crossed to the window and peered out. There he was, moving through the late afternoon light like a figure cut from the horizon itself. Big Jack sat tall in the saddle, one hand loose on the reins, his coat brushing the horse's flanks. He didn't need to hurry, the entire world seemed to move for him. He stopped at her gate, dismounted, and simply waited. He didn't knock, didn't call out. He just stood there, his silhouette framed by the lowering sun, and waited for her to come out. Clara stayed by the window, her heart twisting in her chest. She felt torn down the middle. One part of her, the practical, cautious part, screamed to stay inside, to keep her life neat and safe and untouched. But another part of her, the part that woke at night to the sound of coyotes and felt the emptiness of her own house like a second skin, was pulled toward him like a tide to the moon. Finally, she opened the door. The evening light spilled across her porch and over him, catching the line of his jaw and the steel in his gray eyes. "You're thinkin' too hard," he said, his voice carrying like low thunder. "Life's simple. You and me. The land. Sons to carry on." Her throat tightened. "It's not simple," she whispered. "It is," he said, taking one slow step toward her. "You just ain't said it to yourself yet." The wind rustled the prairie grass beyond town, a lonely, endless sound. Clara stood frozen in the doorway, caught between the life she'd always known and the one this man carried with him like a storm, knowing that whichever way she stepped, there would be no turning back. Dash dash dash. That night, the weight of it all pressed on Clara like a storm cloud refusing to break. The town had gone quiet, its lamps flickering one by one into darkness, leaving only the endless sprawl of prairie under a silver wash of moonlight. Clara lay in her small bed, the quilt pulled tight against her chest, staring at the low ceiling beams. Sleep would not come. Each creak of the old house, each distant coyote's call, seemed to echo with the rhythm of hoofbeats she had come to know so well. She rose at last, unable to stand the stillness, and crossed to the window. The night wind pressed cool against the glass. Her eyes traced the horizon out of habit, and there, just at the edge where the moonlight kissed the grass, she saw a shape moving. A rider, dark and tall, cutting a line straight toward her. Her heart jumped, her fingers curling into the window frame. When the horse stopped at her yard, Big Jack didn't move for a long moment. He simply sat there, the reins slack in his hand, his silhouette framed in moonlight. Even at this distance, she felt his presence as if he stood in the room with her. Slowly, he dismounted, the sound of his boots crunching on dirt carrying in the still night. He stopped just short of the porch. "You awake?" he said, not asking, but stating, his voice low and even, carrying like a chord through the quiet. Clara hesitated, then opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The night air wrapped around her, cool and sharp. "You shouldn't come here at this hour," she said softly, though it felt like she was scolding the wind. "I go where I please," Jack said, not with arrogance, but with a plain certainty that made the words heavier than they should have been. "And I figure you got something that needs sayin'." Her hands tightened at her sides. "The whole town's talkin' about me. About us. They think," she faltered, her throat catching. "They think my life ain't mine to decide anymore." He took a step closer, his boots whispering over the dirt. "That's because you're standin' still in a world that keeps movin'." His gaze caught hers, hard and unyielding. "I told you what I want. I told you what I see in you. A man can wait only so long before the wind changes." Clara's breath trembled. "You make it sound so easy," she whispered. "Like I can just walk away from everything I've built here. My school, my students, my life." "Life," he said, voice dropping to a rumble, "ain't four walls and a chalkboard. It's out there." He turned his head toward the open prairie, where the moonlight turned the grass to waves of silver. "It's land that needs a family on it. Sons to carry it forward. A woman who ain't afraid of the wind." His words struck something deep in her chest, a place she had tried to ignore for years. She thought of the quiet nights in her house, the echo of her own footsteps, the way the walls seemed to listen when she sighed. She thought of the schoolroom, bright with children's laughter, and yet how empty it felt when the door closed behind her. A life spent waiting, as if she were holding her breath for something she couldn't name, until now. Jack stepped onto the first plank of her porch, the boards creaking under his weight. "I ain't askin' you to give up yourself," he said, his voice softening, though the edge never left it. "I'm askin' you to take a bigger life. One that fills your lungs instead of squeezin' them." Clara closed her eyes for a moment, gripping the edge of the porch railing, the wood cool under her fingertips. The prairie wind swirled around her, carrying the scent of grass and distant smoke. When she opened her eyes again, he was closer, so close she could see the faint silver of stubble along his jaw in the moonlight. "I'm scared," she said finally, her voice a bare whisper. He nodded once, slow and sure. "So am I," he admitted. "But fear ain't a reason to stay small." The words hung between them, heavy and alive. In that suspended moment, Clara felt the world tilt, as if her safe, quiet life had been balanced on a knife's edge all along. Whether she stepped forward or back, nothing would ever be the same again. The next morning broke with a pale gold light, the kind that blurred the line between dream and waking. Clara stepped out onto her porch with her shawl tight around her shoulders, the chill of dawn biting her skin. The prairie stretched wide and silent before her, carrying the smell of dew-soaked grass and distant wood smoke. She thought the world would feel the same as it always had, yet somehow it didn't. Every shadow, every whisper of wind, seemed heavier, more alive. She had spent the night turning over Big Jack's words in her mind. His voice lingered in her thoughts, rough and steady, speaking of sons and land and a life bigger than the one she had built. Sleep had offered no relief, only fragments of dreams where she was walking across endless grasslands, a hand she didn't see holding hers, the horizon drawing her forward. By the time the sun cleared the low hills, she saw the inevitable, a dark figure on horseback moving down the dirt road toward her. Her chest tightened. There was no rushing in his gait, no hesitation, only the steady, certain approach that seemed to define him. The horse's mane caught the light like black silk, and Jack sat high in the saddle, the brim of his hat shadowing his eyes, his long coat swaying with the movement. Clara stood frozen until he stopped at her gate. He dismounted with his usual fluid motion, dust rising in a soft cloud around his boots. For a moment, he only watched her, his gray eyes unreadable in the morning light. Then he spoke, his voice low and direct. "It's time," he said. Her hands clenched around the edge of her shawl. "Time for what?" "For you to decide," he replied. "I don't wait on a door that won't open. Either you step through it, or I ride on." The words hit like a stone to her chest. A part of her wanted to beg for more time, for the comfort of indecision, but the truth was that she had been living in indecision for years. He was forcing her to face what she had been avoiding. The emptiness in her own life, the hollow ache she carried from day to day. She glanced back into the house, the little wooden table with a single chair pulled out, the cold stove, the tidy rows of books and lessons that had once filled her world. It all looked so small now. She thought of the laughter of her students, the bright chatter of the town's children, and how the sound died every afternoon, leaving her in silence. She thought of the horizon and the wind and the wildness that seemed to follow Big Jack like a shadow. Her throat tightened. "If I go with you, there's no coming back," she whispered. Jack stepped closer, his boots crunching softly on the dirt path. "You'll be comin' forward," he said. "Not back. That house'll still be here. That school, too. But you'll be something more." The wind picked up then, sweeping through the grass and carrying the faint scent of earth and horses. A meadowlark called in the distance, a bright, fleeting note against the vast quiet. Clara felt the weight of the moment settle over her like the sky itself. She could almost hear the pulse of her own blood, the fragile thrum of choice. Then, without quite realizing it, her feet moved. One step down from the porch. Another. The ground felt solid, real, and yet her heart fluttered like a bird taking flight. She walked to where he stood, her eyes meeting his without flinching this time. Jack's gaze softened, just slightly, and he held out his hand. "Then let's go." She hesitated only a heartbeat before placing her hand in his. It was warm, rough, steady, the hand of a man who had carved his life out of earth and wind. Together, they walked to the horse. He helped her up, his strength effortless, and then swung into the saddle behind her. As the horse began to move, Clara turned her head for one last look at the little house, the narrow street, the world she had known. It seemed smaller already, like a memory fading in the sun. Ahead stretched the prairie, endless and wild, promising both risk and possibility. The wind caught her hair, and for the first time in years, Clara let herself breathe deep, filling her lungs with the scent of open land. Behind her, Jack's arm rested firm and sure around her waist, and the steady rhythm of the horse carried them toward the horizon, where the sky opened wide and waiting. Life, she realized, had finally begun to move.